So this Vines et al. Piece is really short, but it highlights the potential depth of this problem. Basically what they find when they look at a particular literature in biology is in a setting where there were no requirements to post data or very limited requirements to post data, data quickly disappears. It's very hard to access. So what they do is they get 500 articles over 20 years published within a specific subliterature within biology, and they try to get the data. That's basically the goal. So they try to find the email addresses of the authors. The original papers have email addresses. A bunch of times they bounce. They look for them on the web. They try to email them. They try to email them again until they reply. A lot of time they don't reply. Even when they reply, they rarely share the data. But they basically show the breakdown at each of those steps. It's kind of an interesting exercise. Now, every community will be different. In some research communities, there's maybe better data sharing. But they just did this a few years ago again. So, first finding, it's very difficult to contact published authors. A lot of email addresses bounce, and the ability to secure data drops off very quickly. So even 5-10 years back, it's hard to get data. So overall, out of their 500 articles, they were only able to get the data for about 20%. 80% of the data just wasn't accessible. Now, maybe if they'd been more persistent, maybe if they had sent 10 emails instead of 2 or 3, maybe if they'd called up the author 5 times, but that's not how it's supposed to go, right? It's not supposed to be the case. You have to spend months of your life getting data. It's supposed to be freely shared. It's supposed to be. So this is the data in their table. Hopefully you guys can see this. This is sort of the year by year in terms of, that's the publication year on the left. And because they had sort of limited bandwidth, they just coded up every other year. Once you go back to some of the older articles, 30-40% of the time there's no working email. For the more recent articles, usually there's a working email. The author responds to the email maybe 50 to 60% of the time, but maybe 40% of the time they don't. They very often don't even give a response that's meaningful in terms of the status of the data. Sometimes they say the data's lost, especially for the old studies. So what he says is in a lot of these old studies, they're like, and this is 20-something years ago, they're like, it's on a floppy disk. My new computer doesn't have a floppy disk reader. I don't even know how to get this to you. So they only actually get the data 19% of the time. This is just like kind of demoralizing. And definitely for the old studies, you're just not going to get the data, basically. Like this is just lost to science. No one's going to be able to extend this stuff or reanalyze it. 6 years ago, 2009 or so, an editor took over AJPS named Rick Wilson, who was really strongly in favor of data posting and made it a requirement that papers published in AJPS post their data. As of 2013, when a review was done, very few political science journals sort of require data posting. And even those who have policies may only really weakly enforce them. And there's kind of a consensus that that's the case. Defoe presents and collects data about just how much of a problem this is. And this is data that links back up to the Vines et al. Piece and the availability of psychology data. He surveyed PhD students in his class at Yale as well as in a statistical methods class at Harvard. Asked them what their experience was with the papers they tried to replicate. Like, could they find the replication file? So he got, and I forget what the sample was for his survey here, however many dozen observations from people who were trying to replicate studies and try to get data. And what he basically finds is, in about 50% of the cases, basically there isn't enough posted to replicate the study. Some of them have nothing available, even when you ask the author. Some only have the data, not the code. Some have the code and not the data, etc. So, he basically had this sort of survey. He, consented people and asked them all these questions about their experiences. And this is the kind of key bottom line figure. This is from his appendix. Proportion of responses where there were just no replication materials available was 20-something%. Cases where there was limited data, but so limited you can't even do any analysis, was another 20-something%. So it's basically half the cases. And then there's this kind of distribution of quality in terms of availability of code or data. And, in some, it was like, yeah, there was enough to kind of do what I needed to do. In others, I could do most of what I needed to do. So there's this sort of continuum. But in a full half the cases, These folks just couldn't get the data. And a lot of the papers they wanted to replicate were recent papers. These were like PhD students trying to get on the research frontier looking at recent papers. So this is like a best case scenario. If you go back 15 years, it's like got to be worse than this, or 10 years. So it's sort of like field after field, we're still in a weird equilibrium, it seems, where people aren't sharing their data. Journals may be able to exploit their leverage, and they may be a key sort of institution for getting data online. Defoe presents and contrasts AJPS policy under Rick Wilson, where they very seriously pushed for data sharing, with the APSR policy of encouraging data posting. And making it clear that there's an expectation that data will be shared with interested scholars. But basically no enforcement. But what Rick Wilson did is he basically held up publication early on as editor of a bunch of papers and was like, no, I'm not going to run your paper until you give me the data. Like, he was serious about it. He would himself check out the replication files to see that they ran. And then they pushed very hard to get all the data posted on Dataverse. The left-hand panel is AJPS, and Rick Wilson takes over in 2009. So in 2009, the papers published in 2009, basically none of those papers published state that their replication data is available. But by 2010, it's sort of a mix, and by 2011 and 12, almost all of them state that their data is available. He made them say that. He's like, you have to state in the article your data is available, and you have to post it. This follow-on plot, again, left-hand side is AJPS, right-hand side is APSR, is data that when you actually go to look for it, actually is available. Like, he could find it. Like, Defoe could easily find the data. And even though it isn't quite 100%, you see a huge improvement. From like 2009, this isn't that long ago, none of the data was available. In like the leading political science journal, there were like 2 folks who share their data or something, like 2 nerds, And then by the end, it's 75%. So this is a massive improvement. In 2 years, you go from no data to 70% of data being posted. That's a big improvement. So it actually, again, it suggests that journals have leverage, and this may be a promising way forward.